Welcome back. Now, we've been looking this week at the rise in far-right movements in parts of Europe. They've been largely fuelled by the austerity that followed the crisis in the Eurozone. But is there a danger that Britain could be beginning to experience something similar for completely different reasons? A backlash whipped up in the wake of the Woolwich murder. The far-right English Defence League have taken to the streets repeatedly over the last week in an attempt to capitalise on the death of Lee Rigby. The group has marched twice in Woolwich, as well as in Newcastle and Westminster, clashing with police and airing a crude anti-Muslim message. They say they are protesting against extremist Islam and supporting British troops, but their message often targets ordinary Muslims. Attacks on Muslims are increasing. 10 mosques have been targeted across the country in the last week. In Grimsby, 3 petrol bombs were thrown at the Islamic Cultural Centre while people were inside. 2 men are remanded in custody today, charged with arson with intent to endanger. The hate crime monitoring group Faith Matters say they have received reports of over 190 Islamophobic incidents since last Wednesday. Before the attack, about 4 to 8 cases a day were reported to its helpline. They say that of the 632 incidents they've dealt with in the last year, over half are related to far-right groups like the EDL. Police say they've received far fewer reports of incidents than Faith Matters, but in Whitehall, the government is yet to intervene. Police say they will continue to monitor the situation on a national level. Well, with me now, Asghar Bukhari from the Muslim Public Affairs Committee, MPAC, and in another of our studios, a former member of the BNP and National Front, Matthew Collins, who's now an anti-fascist activist. And let me start with you. I mean, how long-lasting do you think this wave of anti-Muslim violence is going to be? Matthew Collins, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yes. Sorry, what was the question again? Sorry?
Yeah, no, I was asking you, how long-lasting do you think this wave of anti-Muslim backlash, violent backlash, is going to be?
Well, I think after any major incident, the experts tend to say the first week is the most trying and the most testing. And what we're talking about is actually just a spike. If you go back to the figures you quoted earlier in the report, you'll see that actually there's been a growing increase in Islamophobic behaviour and attacks on mosques and attacks on individuals from the Muslim faith. So it's a spike, and obviously at this time there's a peak, but it's an ongoing problem. You know, it's not something that just happened this week. Muslims in this country have been targeted by groups like the EDL and the BNP now for a very long time.
But if you look at the EDL specifically, I mean, you might argue they were in some disarray until recently. And actually now they're able to organise demonstrations again and get people out on the streets.
Yeah, and again, that's just a spike. The organisation was as good as finished last week. It had about another month to go. It was unlikely their leader would even turn up to Newcastle. But what we're actually seeing is just mainly, again, it's just the people that dropped out of the EDL. You know, we say that the EDL is actually symptomatic of an issue in this country. And so it's people that dropped out, but were still available to the EDL. People had created new networks, but the reality of it is when something like this happened, we were aware that those sort of networks would reignite, and again the EDL would experience a slight spike. But you know, until last Wednesday, the EDL was as good as finished.
But I suppose, I mean, what some people might fear is that you get almost a perfect storm. You get a motivation in the Woolwich murder, and you've got great austerity, great alienation amongst poor, working class communities. And that comes together to form a new far-right strength. I mean, are you saying that's not a fear?
Well, it's a fear, but the organisation I work for, Hope Not Hate, we weren't born yesterday. We didn't just start up yesterday, and we've been out in communities up and down the country, and there are people who are prepared to resist this hatred. You know, when this terrible murder happened in Woolwich, there were 2.5 million other Muslims in this country who were working in hospitals, who were doctors, who were nurses, who were driving buses, who were leaning on their garden fence having a cup of tea with their neighbour. And I think the reality of it is that, you know, we're not Germany. This isn't the 1930s. You know, we are an intelligent country, like everybody else, going through difficult times. But the majority of people in this country do not see hatred as a way of dealing with this problem.
Asghar Bukhari, I beg your pardon. We've seen all sorts of attacks on Muslims across the country today. One organisation said about 200, women having their veils pulled off. How deep do you think ordinary Muslims feel fear right now?
Really deeply. I mean, I think the fear, as your previous speaker said, is kind of growing over the last few years, because obviously this narrative, this story that Muslims are perceived as almost freedom-hating, violent fanatics, and that story gets pushed into society by certain segments of the media.
And not just Muslims,
forces.
anyone who could be mistaken for a Muslim.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that kind of hatred seeping into society echoes in the Muslim mind, because they fear that society is turning against them. The sad thing, I think, with the Muslim community is that the Muslim leadership is acting almost like petrified sheep, waiting for the wolf to come and devour them, hiding. And you can't hide from this. You have to, the leadership, the Muslim leadership has to go out and challenge it. They need to open their doors and say, we want to talk to the British public. They shouldn't wait and hope that it will go away, and they need to do that, and they're not.
Let me ask you about the other sort of political movement that's been happening this year, which has really been the growth of UKIP. Mm-hmm. Which are very different, obviously, to the far-right movements, but anti-European, David Cameron called them closet racists. That's something they fiercely denied. I mean, do you think they play into this at all?
Absolutely. And they're the kind of semi-respectable face of what we consider, at least, Islamophobia, this kind of respectable face of this kind of right-wing move, shift in the UK. And it comes from all strands. You're getting the EDL, the kind of not so respectable face of kind of this right-wing racism, and then
but you think they're part of the same line?
Absolutely, they're part of the same line.
And Matthew Collins, would you agree with that?
Well, I think UKIP represents something quite different. I mean, UKIP seem to be stuck in the 1950s. They have all kinds of attitudes about unmarried mothers and women wearing trousers as well. But UKIP are picking up where the BNP fell off. They're not a fascist organisation in the terms of the BNP or the EDL, but they do represent a growing ultra-conservatism that seems to be a way of people dealing with very difficult circumstances, which is a constant demonisation of people on benefits, people who are migrants, people who are seeking work and out of work. That's a growing trend. But they're very different to the BNP in a lot of ways, because obviously UKIP aren't an organisation that's calling for repatriation. Yeah. It's not an organisation that's calling for hanging of people in the streets. It's slightly more conservative than that, but still UKIP do seem to want to take us back to like the Enoch Powell era, and also take us back to the black and white television, that kind of time. It's an old-fashioned party.
Just finally, I mean, do you see any similarities between the extremes at both ends of radicalised Muslims and EDL? In that they're all marginalised people.
Absolutely, they're two sides of the same coin, aren't they? They're both see the world in this binary fashion, and that has to clash, that has to fight, and has to hate each other. And until we can join forces and start to push that back, we're going to see real trouble in this country.
I'm sorry, we must leave it there, but thank you both very much indeed for joining us.